Good evening. Thank you. My name is Brent Reedy. I am the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the Research Libraries for the New York Public Library. I have the distinct honor of welcoming you to tonight's event. Whether you are in the room or out there online, thank you for joining us. We are incredibly fortunate tonight to have Meredith Broussard, who is here to talk about her new book, More Than a Glitch, Confronting Race, Gender, and Ability in Tech. This is my copy. You can't have it, but we are selling copies outside the room. I'll mention more on that in a second. But first, I want to just say that it's particularly exciting to have this topic here tonight and these two individuals here tonight to speak with us. As you may well know, should know, Meredith is an esteemed data journalist and author. She's in the forefront of exploring where artificial intelligence and algorithms and technology fail us. Her first book, Artificial Unintelligence: How Computers Misunderstand the World, was a riveting look at the limits and flaws of technology that we too often admire as somehow smarter than or superior to the humans who make it. She coined the term techno-chauvinism, the misguided belief that technology is always the answer. Her work has been deeply influential for us here at the library. We've been a leader in leveraging technology to serve our patrons. We've invested in Simply E, a privacy-forward, open-source, librarian and patron-centered e-reading application. We launched one of the world's first digital collection sites, which today has millions of visitors a year, looking at over 900,000 items, many in the public domain. In all of this work, however, we are careful not to be techno-chauvinists, to not think that technology is the only way forward. Indeed, we are acutely aware that our physical books, our in-person services meet many of our patrons' needs, and how the digital divide means that millions of New Yorkers still don't have ready access to the internet or our digital tools. And as we begin to explore how machine learning and artificial intelligence can improve or change our work, we are acting with extreme caution to mitigate against the race, gender, and ability biases that exist in these technologies. So to say that we've been eagerly awaiting this book is an understatement. More Than a Glitch continues incredibly important work. Meredith will be speaking tonight with none other than Alondra Nelson, who is the Harold F. Linder Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study and was until very recently a Deputy Assistant to President Biden and Acting Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Alondra has been an extraordinary leader and thinker on matters of technology and equality. I can't imagine a better conversation partner for tonight. But don't take it from me. You have both of their bios in your program, and it's online too. Please peruse them. They are overwhelmingly impressive. More Than a Glitch is available for sale right outside this room. Meredith is going to stick around and sign copies. I devoured the book this weekend. It's been out for 6 days. Get it now. It's hot off the press. I urge you to get a copy. All proceeds go to benefit the New York Public Library. And you also can, of course, check out a copy with your library card, though I imagine there's probably going to be a long wait list for the copies that we have. At the end of the conversation tonight, Meredith will be glad to take a few of your questions. If you're here with us in the room, you've already seen the paper and pencils that are on your chairs. Please write your questions at any time. My colleagues will be circulating occasionally through the event to take them and collect them and bring them forward. If you are watching out there online, you can enter your questions in chat, or you can email them to us at publicprograms@nypl.org, and we will throw them in the mix. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Espahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course, by all of you. Thank you for your support, and thank you for being here tonight. Now please welcome Meredith Broussard and Alondra Nelson.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Brent, for that introduction. It's great to be here with all of you. couldn't think of a more timely topic as we are consumed, and who would have thought that AI would be sort of populating the sort of news cycle again and again over the last few weeks. So here we are in conversation. So first of all, congratulations to you. And I really want to begin the conversation by, I think, introducing folks who don't know you to you and your work. You have the many distinctions, and one of them is being, I think among the few people who've written 2 books about AI and about machine learning and the sort of issues that we face in contemporary culture around them in the course of less than a decade, I think in the course of sort of 8 years. And you're also a Black woman writing in this space, Black woman computer scientist and data journalist writing in this space. So tell us a little bit about your trajectory and your journey. How did you get to this book and to writing in this area more generally?
Well, thank you for that question, Alondra. Thank you, Brent. I am really excited to be here tonight. And I got started in my career as a computer scientist. I studied computer science at Harvard as an undergraduate, and I started my professional career doing mainstream CS. But I left for all of the reasons that, kind of textbook reasons that women get edged out of STEM careers. I faced racism, I faced sexism. It was too much. I quit to become a journalist. And then I came back to computer science eventually as a data journalist. So what I do as a data journalist is the data journalism is the practice of finding stories and numbers and using numbers to tell stories. And what I'm doing in this book and in my last book is clarifying complex technical topics and hopefully empowering people to understand when algorithms are making decisions that are unfair.
So you began the book. I mean, you began the book in a bit talking about sort of a black box. So that's something that we use in a lot of fields. We use it in computer science. We use it in science and technology studies to sort of talk about the sort of complexity of a mechanism or a particular function. And you caution us against using the black box. So I wanted to begin with your caution around that, something that we kind of think is a kind of neutral term that we use, and say more about that.
Well, I'm kind of aware of how convenient it is to use the term black box because when I go to cocktail parties and people say, "Oh, what are you working on?" and then I actually start explaining what I'm working on, then they get a little bored. So I'm keenly aware of how convenient it is to have an abstraction that allows us to go on with the conversation, to say, "Oh, let's just think about this program as black box. There's the goes into, that just comes out of, and what's inside is just magic or whatever." But when you really dig into technology, you realize that the black box is just an abstraction, and we need better words for talking about what happens inside computational systems, because we're well past the age when we can get away with saying, "Oh yeah, I don't really understand what's happening inside." So it's not that the black box is unknowable, right? It takes a little bit of work to understand what's happening inside the black box of an AI system or inside an algorithm. You absolutely can understand it. It just depends on your own level of computational literacy, the level of computational literacy and communication ability of the person who's explaining it, and you have to be willing to put in the time. And increasingly, we need to put in the time as citizens, as members of a democracy.
I'm glad that you went there, because that was what I thought reading the book. I thought, as someone who's guilty of having used black box quite a lot, and I do think it's a useful metaphor, it's terribly disempowering. And so, I think one of the sort of concerns that we, I think, have is that we've got these increasingly complicated systems, but we actually need democracy to work, and we need people to be able to think about them in a way that makes sense to them. Everyone doesn't have to be a computer scientist. Everyone doesn't have to be able to unpack the black box. But I think we're fortunate to have people like you who are able to open up that black box and make the stakes for democracy, the stakes for users and consumers sort of clear to folks in ways that are important. So certainly that these things aren't unknowable. I think your book is so good at that, and also that it's important that we do know and that we can know. So I really appreciated that. So you take us in the book through several case studies and sort of important cases, some that won't be a surprise to some folks here, but things that are being sort of amplified and scaled by generative and general AI. Predictive policing is one, and facial recognition technology is another. So I would love to hear you just talk through those cases. I mean, you offer us, I mean, they're quite harrowing cases in a couple of different chapters in the book. In both instances, stories about African-American men who were wrongly, in one case, or in several cases, arrested using facial recognition technology. And then in another case, a gentleman who they weren't sure if he was being predicted to be a victim of violence or a subject of violence, and the
That
predictive
was
algorithm.
particularly horrifying.
Yeah. So I'll open that up for you to say more.
So let me start with that case
Yeah.
that you just mentioned, because this is really haunting for me. So there was a man who lived in Chicago, and one day there was a knock on his door, and it was the police and some social workers, and they said, well, a predictive policing algorithm has identified you as being at risk for being involved in a crime. And we don't know if that means that you're going to be the perpetrator of the crime or the victim of the crime. But our algorithm says that crime is going to happen to somebody who lives at this address. And the man said, go away. I have no use for your algorithm. But they kept coming back. Mm-hmm. And they offered to get him into programs. They offered to help him find a different job. They offered all of the, crime deterrent things that they thought would be helpful. And he said, no, thank you. Please go away. But they kept coming back. And eventually people in the neighborhood noticed that the police kept coming around because their cars were outside. And he got a reputation for being a snitch, and he was shot. Now, this is exactly the opposite of what I'm sure was intended with this predictive policing software. They probably thought that they were trying to prevent crime in the future. But it lets us look at the ways that predictive policing software works, and it allows us to think about who gets the short end of the stick every single time when it comes to predictive policing software, or when it comes to facial recognition software, which works better on light skin than on dark skin. It works better on men than on women, does not include trans and non-binary folks at all. And if we do an intersectional analysis of its efficacy, it works best of all on men with light skin, and it works worst of all on women with dark skin, right? And so then you might say, oh, well, maybe we just take the software and we improve the training data, right? Because the problem with facial recognition is that, or the reason that facial recognition doesn't work well on, say, women with darker skin is often that there aren't women with darker skin in the training data set. So maybe we just put in more pictures in the training data. Well, that doesn't actually solve the problem, because these types of technologies are disproportionately weaponized against communities of color, against poor communities. So a better solution is actually not using facial recognition in policing at all.
So I wanted to put the two accounts together, right? Because the chapters appear together, and so I was thinking through them together. This is hard stuff. So the predictive policing case is, you have this cases in Chicago, and then the police are thinking, we're going to use community-based interventions, right? I mean, you can imagine that one account of that story, or one explanation, is that they are trying to think through how they can do early interactions that might intervene in a bad outcome, even as you demonstrate so clearly that they sort of precipitate a worse outcome. So I wanted to sort of think through, is there a way that technology is ever possible to be used in these spaces. I mean, you have written about more than 24 states that have effectively banned facial recognition technology. Is the techno-chauvinism, as you would use it, sort of so pronounced that we really can't use these technologies in law enforcement, or is there some way that they're useful at all?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I mean, as a reporter who focuses on algorithmic accountability reporting, my job is mostly about finding the failures of the system, and so that's really what I focused on in the book, because there's so much rhetoric about technology is so great and it's going to change the world, and you kind of hear this narrative over and over and over again. And I actually got a little tired of hearing that narrative, because I'd heard the same promises about the bright technological future for my entire career. So I'm in the bleeding edge of people who have had the internet their entire adult lives. So I started college like the month after the web started, right? And I was building web pages in college, and it was really fun. So it is entirely possible that there are useful applications of technology in policing. I'm not super aware of them.
Yeah.
I mean, the second case of the man who was wrongfully arrested for stealing watches from a high-end watch store was a case that was widely reported in the New York Times.
This is Robert Williams.
Williams, yeah. And so he was misidentified by a facial recognition program. And one of the things that surprised me was I kind of traced out what are all of the steps that had to happen, like what are all the failure points in the system for him to have to spend the night in jail, to be like wrestled away from his family. And there were a lot of failure points. There were a lot of opportunities for people to do things differently, and they just didn't.
Yeah. I mean, look, the answer may well be no, and I think we've got to be willing to say, to your point, that, that maybe for policing in the context in which we know that there's already considerable bias in other ways coming in before the technologies were even deployed, and the process of the technologies being deployed, and as you demonstrate, often as the technologies are being designed and implemented, maybe the answer is no, and we need to be able to sort of say that as well, and your work is so important for that. So one of the use cases that's supposed to work, that does get reported on, is in the medical space. There are a few things that make it a bit more promising. One is that in a formal medical setting, you have sort of federal privacy legislation. So as you write, in the book, that a lot of this work, a lot of the training data is created by, in some ways, very cavalier and maybe even borderline illegal sort of scraping and scooping of people's data. In the healthcare setting, you've got sort of regulations and laws that mean that there are different kinds of sort of constraints and guardrails around that. So maybe promising in that way. And then the big promise, of course, is often medical imaging, radiology, is the sort of thing that the point to cancer screening in particular. So you write beautifully in the book about, and there was an excerpt of this in Wired just this week if people didn't capture that. And you write very honestly about your own experience with a cancer diagnosis and how you do your own individual personal auditing. And we're going to come to auditing later because that's one of the things that you sort of offer as a solution for some of this. But I wanted to hear you talk about a bit about this use case that's supposed to be so hopeful, so promising, and the real sort of pitfalls of it, and your own kind of experience with this technology in this space.
Well, I should start by saying I'm fine. Like, I had cancer. I'm fine now. Thank you for asking. So what happened was I was diagnosed with breast cancer shortly before the pandemic. and I had major surgery, and then the entire world shut down. So there I was, just stuck at home and extra miserable because cancer surgery, and everybody else was miserable because COVID, and it was just terrible. And one of the things I did during that time was I poked around in my medical chart. So you know how you can get into your own electronic medical record and you can read what the doctor is writing about your case. I'm very nosy. I'm a journalist, so I'm very nosy. And I noticed something in my chart that said this image was read by an AI. And I thought, oh, well, that's weird. What did the AI read? And why is the AI reading my cancer scans? And it sent me down this rabbit hole where eventually I came up with this experiment where I was going to take my own mammogram films, because again, electronic medical record. I was going to take my own mammograms and run them through an open source AI in order to write about the state of the art in AI-based cancer detection. And it turned out that some of the state-of-the-art work is being done by colleagues at NYU. Really convenient. So I download the software and I try and run my mammograms through it in order to find out if the AI would detect my cancer. So this is a reproducibility endeavor in science. We talk a lot about open science and reproducibility, and the idea is that if you publish the code and the data used to run a scientific experiment, somebody else can download that code and data, run the experiment themselves, and get the same results. Now, a couple of things happened in this process. I realized that I had a lot of misconceptions about what this was going to be like. I talk a lot about the confusion that we have about AI, where Hollywood is really deeply lodged in our brains, and we think about the Terminator, we think about Ex Machina. It turns out that my impressions of medical technology are really informed by Grey's Anatomy. So I was expecting some kind of spectacular Grey's Anatomy moment with the gradually appearing thing, and it would be like, there's a tumor. And it was not like that.
You got a CD, in fact, actually. You got
I got
20th
a
century
CD
technology.
in the mail. I mean, does anybody in the room even have a CD drive? Anyway? All right. Okay, we've got 4 people with CD drives. All right. So it was disheartening to realize that, oh, wait, in really state-of-the-art medical imaging, there's still really outmoded technology being used. And part of that is, as you said, because it's a highly regulated environment, which made me feel really safe. But at the same time, I realized that the obstacles in the system were so substantial that I really don't believe in the bright future of AI-based cancer detection. It is not right around the corner. It is absolutely possible that someday it will happen. But if you have read, say, major media accounts recently about advances in imaging for cancer detection, the immediacy of that is dramatically overstated.
Yeah, I mean, it's usually in paragraph 8 or something. So
Right.
The story that I'm thinking of recently was sort of the lead was we've done it. And then it was sort of 5 paragraphs or 8 paragraphs down. Yeah.
I mean, there just aren't that many AI cancer scientists who have their own mammograms as well. I mean, which is worth noting. I mean, you think about the mammogram technology as well. That is an extremely uncomfortable imaging process. And, enough said about that.
Yeah, I mean, no, but I think it raises a bigger question about technology, about who gets to sit at the table and, issues around design and access that you write so beautifully about. So another of the sort of great hopes, and I think was around educational technology. And certainly, I mean, you raised the pandemic. We know that during the course of the pandemic, that cancer rates rose precisely because people couldn't get any kind of screening technology at all. And we also know that we just had this grand social experiment in which young people, students, were using technology, because there was, in many cases, nothing else that they could use. And so one of the great hopes, of course, for automation and AI and technology more broadly at scale is, around the technological piece. We have enough evidence, growing evidence, unfortunately, that the learning loss was pronounced, and that technology, I think, didn't sort of demonstrate itself as being the sort of silver bullet that we needed. More evidence of techno-chauvinism. But let's talk about that, because I think it's a space where there's both hope and lots of pitfalls, including the extraordinary experience of a young woman that you write about named Isabel Castaneda, who's doing her international baccalaureate exam. And I'll let you take the story from there, because like the predictive policing one, I think folks will hardly even be able to believe this. But over to you.
Oh, yeah, this was particularly horrifying to me as a professor, because I love and hate educational technology, like most people in education. I mean, there are things that it does wonderfully. There are things that it does really, really badly. But this particular story horrified me because during the pandemic, the International Baccalaureate Organization, which is this international organization that gives a special secondary diploma. Right, so you get a high school diploma, and then you can also earn an IB diploma, which is prestigious, and it's based on your grades and also on some high stakes tests administered usually during your senior year. But the tests are usually administered in person, and so during the pandemic, they could not administer the IB exam. So what they did was they decided to use an algorithm. And they used this algorithm to assign imaginary grades to real students. So they said, oh, this algorithm is so good, it's going to predict the grades that the students would have gotten on the test that they didn't take. And I mean, it's such... I can barely explain like how ridiculous this seems to be now, but we all made kind of crisis decisions during the pandemic.
Sure.
Okay. But the way that this algorithm worked is just particularly upsetting, because what it did was it predicted that the poor students would get bad grades and that the rich students would get good grades. And if you are, versed in educational statistics, that, income is generally correlated with educational outcomes. So it's completely obvious that this is how this system would have predicted student grades. And this is also exactly opposite to what we think about education. We think about education as a ladder. Right? And so Isabel Castaneda is a first-generation student who attended school in a low-income community in Colorado, but had straight A's, was a heritage Spanish speaker, and the IB algorithm predicted that she would fail her Spanish exam, which is absurd. Right? So it's a really good example of why we should not be using algorithms to assign imaginary grades to real students, but also what are the pitfalls of too much belief in algorithms in education?
Yeah, one of the things I thought was so poignant about your account of Isabel is how it affected her. So she, on the one hand, she begins by knowing full well how talented she is. I'm a straight A student, as you are reporting on her own reactions, but then she comes to doubt herself. And so that kind of pernicious, corrosive, I think, encounter for her, and, hopefully because you have shined a light on it and others have, that it won't have a sort of enduring impact. But imagine what that does to young people to sort of think like, I thought I was really good at this, but the techno-chauvinism, the technology says not, and so maybe I'm not.
Right.
And so you can think about Claude Still's work on stereotype threat. I mean, you can think about sort of spinning this out in a way that, that technology and ed tech becomes part of a kind of stereotype threat sort of scenario for people. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, there is the kind of surveillant piece as well. And so there are other kinds of ed tech systems. My concern as someone who was, recently in government is really about privacy issues. And you write quite a lot about this, particularly with regards to young people. If, on the one hand, the strongest privacy regulation that we have is something like HIPAA in the healthcare sector, we are not there yet with educational technology and for our young people and privacy and for all of us more generally. So I wanted to hear you talk about the sort of the ed tech, the more surveillant issues around that.
One of the things that horrified me, I feel like I'm telling a lot of horror stories tonight. One of the things that horrified me writing the book was surveillance technology for testing. So during the pandemic, this was offered as a very popular solution that we were going to do remote proctoring. But remote proctoring systems have all of the same problems of facial recognition systems. Right. And so they don't work as well for people with darker skin. They're also really brittle and not that good at recognizing objects. So you would have people doing something like getting a tissue to blow their nose, and then the system flags them as having a piece of paper and says, "Oh, you're cheating," right? Or students with bad internet access would have bandwidth issues and then would spend, some of the test time trying to get back into the testing system that had kicked them out. So the technology just doesn't work well enough to be our salvation. And I think we need to stop expecting the technology to work perfectly, right? And we need to stop putting so much faith in the technology. And I think Brent, in his introduction, put this really well. Like, one of the things that libraries do really well is libraries invest in the cutting edge digital stuff and then also have the print books available. And so you can go to your public library and you can access the material in whatever way works for you. Based on your inclinations, based on your abilities, just based on what you feel like doing that day, right? And that's a better way of thinking about things. We, for a very long time, have had this narrative of, oh, we're going to do it better, faster, cheaper with technology. But actually, no, it's like more expensive and time consuming, and the maintenance is super annoying. So let's add nuance to our discussion.
Indeed, and some protections. I mean, one of the things I've found interesting, particularly in light of reading your book over the last couple of weeks, has been our conversations about generative AI and about ChatGPT-3, ChatGPT-4. Some of the critique, and there's lots of critique, has been around, we've just let this thing out in the wild, and sort of people are just, having to deal with this technology, and we hadn't thought about the product or the potential products. But we're doing that in schools as well. I mean, a lot of this we don't talk about it in the same way, but a lot of some of this educational technique is really kind of social experimentation with children and seeing young people, seeing what works and what doesn't work. And so it's interesting when the sort of putting it out into the public without proper testing sort of critique sort of emerges for us in a particular sort of way. I think the same critique could be made of some of the ed tech.
Well, there's also data leakage.
Yes.
In the educational sphere. So there is all of this educational data, right? And when there is a giant pool of data scientists get really excited and they're like, "Ooh, hey,
social scientists get really, we
all get really excited. We
data.
love data.
We
Data
love
is
data.
great. I get excited about data." So at any rate, there is leakage. So there's one case that I read about in Pasco County, Florida, where the local police had built predictive policing software to predict future criminals. And by now you can all guess who it predicted were going to be the future criminals. And then they got data from the local school district. And the local school district was not paying attention to student privacy issues and just handed over the data. And so the police then ran this predictive policing software on the school data and said, oh, these kids are future criminals. Right? So your D in science class like marked you as entering into the school to prison pipeline.
Yep.
Which is horrible.
Yeah. So you're hopeful. I mean, I think we're both hopeful. I think the thing
I'm not all depressing.
We're not all depressing, and I think the thing that we that you and I have talked about before is that as much as we are critics and critical, we also do the work because we do find technology useful and interesting in some other ways, and want innovation to be something that can be demonstrated with people's full rights, their full empowerment, as part of that calculation and as part of how we think about a future for different kinds of new and emerging technologies. So let's talk about the hope a little bit. You offer a sort of few reasons why you're hopeful, despite the accounts that we've talked about in the little bit of time that we've had this evening.
So I think that two things really make me feel very optimistic. The first line of my last book was, I love technology. And I do. I love building technology. I especially like building technology for my garden. Right? It's pretty fun to mess around with that. And so I am ultimately optimistic. So two things that make me optimistic are public interest technology and algorithmic auditing. Right? What do I mean by public interest technology? Well, this is a new movement, and it is exactly what it sounds like. It's about creating technology in the public interest. So sometimes that means, say, building better government technology, which, Alondra, you could tell us a lot about this. And maybe that means something like strengthening a state unemployment website so that when there's a pandemic and millions of people are filing unemployment claims at the same time, the website doesn't go down, right? Sometimes public interest technology means doing algorithmic accountability reporting. So this is something that data journalists do, pioneered by Julia Angwin at ProPublica and formerly the Markup. And algorithmic accountability reporting is an extension of the traditional function of the press, right? So the press traditionally held decision makers accountable. In a world where algorithms are increasingly being used to make decisions on our behalf, that accountability function has to transfer. And so algorithmic accountability reporters will investigate algorithms and will also write our own code in order to investigate algorithms or do things like run our own cancer scans. So I'm excited about public interest tech, and then I'm also excited about algorithmic auditing, right? And I'm sure you don't often hear people say they're excited about auditing, right? Auditing comes from the world of compliance, but in the way that I'm using it, it's actually really interesting and exciting. So what we do when we do algorithmic auditing is we open up a black box.
And you've built like an auditing platform or tool, correct?
I did. So one of the things we do as journalists is we do bespoke audits externally. So we will look at the inputs to a system and look at the outputs and then figure out what's going on inside the black box.
So can you narrate an audit for us? I mean, it can be a hypothetical or an actual one, just so people...
Sure.
So it comes down to the ground a little bit for folks. Yeah.
I know, it's kind of a complicated...
It's a black box, Meredith.
It is a black box. It is a black box. All right. So let me back up. The way that machine learning systems work is pretty standard. Right? So you have a giant pool of data and you feed it into the computer and you say, computer, make me a model of the patterns that you see in the data. And the computer says, sure, I'll do that. And it makes this model. And then you can use the model to predict, to make similar decisions to the ones that have been seen in the past. Right? So all the machine learning systems work like this. When people say, oh, I'm using AI for business, they usually mean I'm using machine learning for business. And it is, in fact, not a Hollywood kind of thing, like the name suggests. It's a mathematical process. It's made by people. It's kind of mundane at this point. So in order to reverse engineer what's happening inside a model, you can look at the training data and you can look at the outputs and you can kind of figure out what's happening. So the first and best known example of this is Julia Angwin's machine bias investigation for ProPublica. And what she discovered in that investigation was that there was software that was being used to predict criminal risk, so risk of reoffending, and that this software was biased against Black people. And one of the really revolutionary things that she did was she released the data that she used in order to draw these conclusions, which was a really great move for transparency in reporting, because when you can see the data that somebody has used to draw a conclusion, it helps you have more faith in the reporting. And this kicked off a whole renaissance of mathematicians and computer scientists thinking about social issues and about fairness. And people got really excited about working with the data. And a mathematician, computer scientist, actually proved that there was no way for this system to be fair to white people and to Black people, right? So system, no good. So this is an example of an algorithmic audit. We see this happening more and more. The markup has done some really good work around mortgage approval algorithms, which generally are biased against borrowers of color and privileged borrowers who are white. There is a really great one that came out last week or the week before in Wired. That's done with in collaboration with Lighthouse Reports. And what they did there was they looked at an algorithm in the city of Rotterdam that was allegedly used to detect welfare fraud, but was biased based on ethnicity and gender. I believe what it did was it said if you are not a fluent Dutch speaker, then you are likely going to be someone who commits welfare fraud. Terrible, right? So we do a lot of these one-off audits, and one of the things that I did, because computer science, is I looked at the ways that we were doing auditing, and I said, okay, we're going to need to operationalize this. We're going to need to not do it in a bespoke manner. We need to do it on a platform, and we need to be able to do multiple audits. There need to be standards. We need to work with standards organizations in order to develop benchmarks. And so, yeah, I collaborated with Orca, which is Kathy O'Neill's risk algorithmic auditing and risk consulting firm. And we built a platform. It's called Pilot, and it works
Kathy O'Neill
beautifully.
is, what's Kathy? Objects of Math Destruction.
Yep, Weapons of Math
Math
Destruction.
Yeah.
The book you've probably heard of. It's one of the books, along with Machine Bias, that kicked off kind of the movement around fairness, accountability, and transparency in technology.
Yeah. So what I found hopeful about your work, both this book and the prior book, is that you offer opportunities for action now, because what you don't, I mean, you mention a little bit legislation, you mention a little bit law in the book, but my concern has been a little bit that are waiting for, wouldn't it be amazing to have, omnibus privacy legislation? And I think that we should all, be pushing for that constantly. But I think in some spaces it brings a kind of paralysis. So there's like sort of nothing that we can do. We're like waiting for Godot. We're waiting for, that sort of piece of legislation that's going to make everything better. and so much what I appreciate about both the public interest technology and the way that you think about auditing and algorithmic accountability is that there are things that people have done, can do, are doing right now in the face of, I think, quite dramatic change at scale that's happening in the world. Yeah.
I'm also really optimistic about some of the things that have happened since the book went to press. Right, so the book doesn't deal with ChatGPT at all because it came out after the book went to press. Like, had it come out, a year ago, like it definitely would have been in there. Can we talk a little bit about the blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights?
We certainly can.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy came up with this fantastic proposal called a Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights that looks at what are our rights as citizens and how could we manifest these inside algorithmic systems. And the piece that I particularly like about this blueprint, which I'm being coy, like, Alondra, thank you for making this thing. Like, this is the thing that gives me the most hope. But the piece that I really like is that you call out the cases when algorithms make decisions that go against people. And in that case, you would have the right to protest and to basically have redress, to like talk to somebody who is empowered to change that decision. And I think about all the times I've been frustrated by a decision made by a computer, and then I'll do something like call customer service and try and explain that the computer did something wrong, and then the customer service person, doesn't believe me, and they just dismiss my concerns. And I mean, this gets me very upset, as you can imagine. But it's a pretty big issue when it comes to something like mortgage approvals, because if mortgage approval algorithms are making decisions against borrowers of color, like that is contributing to people of color not being able to build generational wealth. And it's an issue that goes far beyond the level of customer service.
For sure.
Yeah. So I'm really excited about about that being enshrined in policy.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, it helps to have a, president who really cares about this, who has a sense of like common decency around things and like data and people's privacy. And, I think for our part, it was really an attempt to not only be waiting for legislation that we hope comes around antitrust, around privacy, particularly protections for young people, and be able to offer some, I think, guidance. And a lot of it was really, the blueprint is really a culmination of work that you and others have been doing, points to that work, it cites that work, and it's also about what you can do upstream and what you can do downstream. So much of our work is about mitigating harms. How do we think about the systems before you even have to audit them? Mm-hmm. How should we be thinking, wisely, prudently, in a kind of privacy protecting way about systems as we're making them and before we deploy them as well. And, part of it also is that even without legislation, government does have a kind of first mover advantage. Sometimes we're talking about markets, but also sometimes we're talking about norms, and that's how various agencies and things use technology, including automated systems. And so thank you for that. And it was the work of many, continues to be the work of many in government, well beyond me. So we have lots of great questions here. How do we audit algorithms when many models lump people of the same name together for the purpose of accuracy? Because the cost surpasses accuracy. How do we hold such algorithms accountable?
So this is a question that is related to a really common problem. So I think about it in terms of multiple Meredith Broussards, right? So there are 3 other Meredith Broussards out there. And I sometimes think that they must resent me for dominating the Google results for Meredith Broussards. So other Meredith Broussards, I apologize. But this is a problem when you're working with something like campaign finance data, which is something I've worked a lot with. And it's really hard to disambiguate all of the different Meredith Broussards because, especially if they have the same middle initial, it's really hard to keep them separated. So we use machine learning for this. There's fuzzy matching. There is an open source package called dedupe. It's dedupe.io that helps, especially with campaign finance filings, to figure out who's the Meredith Broussard living in New York, and who's the Meredith Broussard living in Pennsylvania, and who's the one living in Texas, and what have you.
Okay. If a child who's failing in school has a greater propensity to turn to crime, couldn't identifying that early lead to positive interventions? It's the training data question and the sort of historical.
Yeah. So let's talk about training data. So as I said before, the way that we build machine learning systems is we take a whole bunch of training data and feed it in, and have the machine detect the mathematical patterns. But history is not destiny. And we do not want our future governed by what has happened in the past. And the big
others' pasts, right?
Yeah, and in others' pasts.
Not your own past, even.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
I mean, I really want to believe in the possibility of change. I also don't want to be judged based on what I was like as a kid. I mean, I'm sure I was a huge pain in the butt as a kid, and I like to think I'm less of a pain in the butt now.
Yeah, and if our friend Ruha Benjamin was sitting here, she would remind us also that even the training data is biased in its accumulation, right? Biased policing systems, that mean the data is biased, even in the collection of it. Okay, so regarding I don't think you write about them, but the racist soap dispensers.
Oh, the racist soap dispenser.
We've seen the videos about the dispenser, the racist soap dispensers. Okay. Regarding the soap dispenser tests and colorist AI mishaps, how does the vast Southeast Asian population and tech weigh in, considering many Southeast Asians have plum-colored skin?
All right. So one of the things that I hope that people get out of the book is that we can think about people's different phenotypes and different cultural identities and the ways that that these might be just suppressed or exploited in computational systems. There was an experiment done by, I think, the BBC, where they looked at automated passport approval systems. So when you get a new passport, you could feed in your photo and the computer would say whether it's approved of this or not. And people of East Asian descent were uniformly identified as having their eyes closed. And so their photos were rejected. Right. So there are lots of different ways that these technologies can fail, and I hope people will just think about what are the worst case scenarios, and then go look for them, and you'll find them. So the racist soap dispenser. I use this example a lot. It's just really helpful in understanding. Okay, why is this technology? Why is technology racist? You don't think a soap dispenser is going to be racist, but you see this video, the man with the light skin puts his hand on a soap dispenser, it works. Man with dark skin puts his hand on a soap dispenser, it doesn't work, right? And then the man with the dark skin takes a white paper towel and holds it under, and it works, right? So I don't think that the people who made this soap dispenser got up in the morning and said, I want to oppress people. I think that what they did was they tested it on themselves and said, oh, it works for us. Maybe they tested it on their family members and said, oh, it works for us. It must work for everybody.
But also, I think it's farther, it's baked farther in time than that, right? I mean, this is you might think of it as another kind of version of the training data set. I mean, these are censoring technologies that go back to the early 20th century with Kodak and IBM. It comes out of that same genealogy of how we think about lighting. And so the implication of the question was sort of, given that there's Asian engineers working in Silicon Valley, why isn't the technology different? But if you're an engineer, you're building something, you're like, what's the best in class sensor that I want for my faucet? That's not you testing it, on yourself. You're plugging in a sensor to a bigger system, and a sensor that has, for decades, has norms that have been sort of built in. I mean, we use like sort of race norms, but in a different way, built into the technology. So, I think.
Well, I love Ruha Benjamin's work on this. I'm so glad you brought her up. Ruha writes about the history of Kodak film and about the racist decisions about color film technology that later manifest in things like the racist soap dispenser. And it's also a way of thinking through other ways that these technologies could be destructive. So when I learned about the racist soap dispenser, I also thought about self-driving cars. And I wondered, hey, is this problematic sensing technology built into self-driving cars? Because it's all cumulative, right? Like it starts with Kodak color film, and then it goes to, to video game sensing technologies, which, by the way, historically did not detect people with darker skin. And then we have the student surveillance technologies. And I wondered, oh, wait, self-driving cars, well, it's sensing technology. Are they going to recognize people with light skin better than people with dark skin? And in fact, they do, right? So even with new technologies, with emerging technologies, we can do a better job of predicting how these technologies will fail and how they will fail in very predictable ways for certain groups of people.
All right, last question. This is Philip from Cornell Tech from the Digital Life Initiative. Shout out to Philip. Given both your experience in journalism and the federal government, and given the state of our federal polarization in our institutions, what is the solution to slowing down the AI race, and how do you engage marginalized communities about bias and harm? Well, that's a question for all of us. Those are our marching orders, Philip.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah.
I mean, Alondra, what do you think? Should people just put us in charge? And then we would
it's
just
never
fix
a bad
it?
idea.
Yeah.
I think it's never
All right.
quite a bad idea.
And I wonder if this slowing down question was prompted by there was a New York Times column about this week, wasn't there? And then Segal Samuel had something in Vox about this.
Well, Ezra
as well.
Klein posed, how do we slow down things? Do we put a sort of speed bump in the technology? Yeah.
I really like the idea that people sometimes propose in contrast to move fast and break things, which is move slow and mend things.
Let's not break them at all.
Or let's not break
We
them
don't
at
need
all.
to mend them if you don't break them at all. If
That's
there's just
true.
much more thought sort of put in from the very beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, if you build with care
Build with care. Yeah.
and you audit.
And you include the public, and
Yeah.
we cannot give away our democracy for technological innovation. And people can understand without being computer scientists and without being digital data scientists. And we've got to it's incumbent upon all of us, I think, to make that happen. So. Well, your book is extraordinary. Thank you so much for the contribution that you're making into one of the critical issues of our time. And thank you for the privilege of this conversation tonight.
Thank you, Alondra.
Thank you all
Thank
for
you,
being here.
everybody. This has been really wonderful. Thank you. And I think we're going to go outside and
You're going to go
we're going to
outside. You're
sign
gonna
some books.
Yeah.